My mother always treated family dinner like a court trial, and I was the permanent defendant. Every Christmas, while my sisters were praised for their suburban houses and traditional marriages, my mother would look at me, sigh, and ask what was wrong with my life choices. But this year, she didn't just sigh. In front of 14 relatives, she raised her glass, laughed, and toasted to my tragic, lonely existence because I was 32 and still hadn't settled down. The entire table chuckled, expecting me to shrink back, blush, and apologize like I used to. Instead, I set down my fork, smiled, and pulled out a single manila envelope from my bag. By the time dessert was served, my mother wasn't laughing anymore, and 3 members of my family were begging me not to call my attorney. Here is how one brutal holiday dinner exposed 20 years of family secrets. My name is Chloe, I'm 32 years old, and to my family, I was an absolute tragedy. In my mother Eleanor's worldview, a woman's worth was calculated by 3 things: a diamond ring, a suburban zip code, and a husband with a country club membership. My older sister, Sarah, had checked every box by 24, marrying a corporate attorney and moving into a gated neighborhood. My brother, Mark, was the golden boy, climbing the corporate ladder while expanding his picture-perfect family. And then there was me. I worked as a senior financial strategist, a title my mother routinely simplified to doing paperwork in a cubicle. Because I didn't have a fiancé on my arm or a nursery to decorate, my life was treated like a project that had stalled out. Every Sunday phone call was a passive-aggressive interrogation about my dating life, subtle jabs about my biological clock, or sympathy for my lonely lifestyle. What my family didn't know, what I deliberately kept hidden, was that my cubicle job was just the cover story. For 6 years, I'd been working 70-hour weeks, quietly acquiring, renovating, and managing commercial real estate properties across the city. While they pitted my simple, quiet life, I was building an empire in the dark, laying the groundwork for a reality none of them could ever imagine. The tension began the second I stepped through the front door of my mother's sprawling house on Christmas Eve. The air smelled of cinnamon, roast beef, and condescension. 14 relatives gathered around the dining table, sparkling under the crystal chandelier. I took my seat near the end, right where my mother, Eleanor, always placed me, far from the head of the table, out of the spotlight. As the wine flowed, so did the backhanded compliments. Sarah boasted about her newly renovated kitchen, while Mark proudly discussed his upcoming promotion. Every time the conversation drifted toward me, Eleanor turned it into a public tragedy. "Chloe's still prioritizing her little career," she remarked loudly, patting my hand with pity. "It's noble, really, how she copes with being on her own while everyone else moves forward." The table chuckled softly. I took a slow sip of water, keeping my expression neutral. But Eleanor wasn't finished. When it came time for the holiday toast, she stood up, glass raised, tapping her silverware against the crystal. "To family," she announced, her voice ringing clear. "And to Chloe. May next year bring her the strength to finally settle down, so she doesn't spend another decade as the unclaimed child sitting at the edge of our table." A wave of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room. Mark smirked into his napkin, and Sarah shook her head in mock sympathy. They expected me to shrink, to look at my plate, to murmur an embarrassed apology for my existence, just like I'd done for 28 years. Instead, I set my glass down with a firm, deliberate click. I looked around the room at 14 faces, watching them laugh at my expense. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. In that single, icy second, something inside me clicked into place. The quiet endurance was over. The silence in the room stretched thin as the laughter died away. Every eye was on me, waiting for the storm or the tears. I didn't cry. I smiled, slowly, leaning back in my chair with an easy composure that instantly shifted the energy at the table. "You know, Eleanor," I said, using her first name instead of Mom for the very first time, "you've been telling everyone at this table for years that I'm struggling, that I'm lonely, broke, and drowning in a dead-end job." My mother's smile faltered. "Chloe, don't be dramatic. It was just a joke." "It wasn't a joke," I interrupted, my voice perfectly level, carrying across the silent dining room. It's the story you tell yourself, so you can feel superior. But let's set the record straight. I took a breath, letting the anticipation hang in the air. I don't just work as a financial strategist. For the last 6 years, I've operated Apex Horizon Capital. I own 6 commercial apartment buildings downtown, 2 retail plazas in the West District, and a controlling share in the development firm that just bought out the land behind your country club. A fork dropped onto a porcelain plate with a sharp ring. Mark's smirk vanished entirely. Sarah stared at me, her glass frozen halfway to her mouth. So, when you toast to my tragic, unclaimed life, I continued, looking directly into my mother's wide eyes, you're talking about a woman whose net worth quadruples everyone else's in this room combined. I didn't fail to settle down, Eleanor. I just chose to build an empire instead of relying on a man or a family inheritance. Eleanor's face turned bright red. That's impossible. You drive a 5-year-old sedan. I invest my money, I replied coolly. I don't spend it trying to look rich for people I barely respect. You're lying, Eleanor stammered, her voice cracking as she tried to regain control of her dining room. You're making a scene because your feelings are hurt. Instead of arguing, I unzipped my leather bag and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. The heavy thud it made against the mahogany table sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. I didn't come here tonight to defend my lifestyle, I said, sliding the envelope toward the center of the table. I came to deliver some overdue paperwork. Sarah reached out timidly, opening the clasp and pulling out the legal documents inside. As her eyes scanned the top page, her face turned pale. What is that? Mark asked, his voice suddenly sharp, defensive. That, I said, looking right at my brother, is the title deed to this very house. The one Mom boasts about owning outright. 3 years ago, when your illegal offshore investments went sour and you faced potential jail time, who paid off your debts, Mark? Mark froze. The color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. Mom panicked, I continued, turning to Eleanor. She couldn't let her golden boy go to prison, so she quietly placed a massive second mortgage on this home to bail him out. But she couldn't keep up with the balloon payments. 6 months ago, this house went into private foreclosure. Chloe, stop this right now. Eleanor gasped, her hands trembling. I bought the debt, Eleanor, I said softly, the truth hanging in the heavy air. I paid off the bank in full. Apex Horizon Capital owns this property. You don't live in your family estate anymore. You live in my rental property, and Mark's reckless gambling is the only reason why. Mark slammed his fists on the table, standing up so fast his dining chair tipped over onto the rug. You little snake, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. That was a private family matter. You had no right to dig into my finances. A private family matter? I asked, keeping my voice utterly calm. You stole over $200,000 from Dad's old legacy trust to fund your bad trades. And when Eleanor realized what you did, she didn't punish you. She hid it. She covered your tracks using money drained from Sarah's trust fund. Sarah gasped, snapping her head toward our mother. What? Mom, is that true? Eleanor couldn't look her in the eye. She stared down at her hands, her immaculate composure completely shattered. Sarah, sweetheart, it was a temporary loan. Mark was going to pay it back. With what money? I interrupted, tossing a secondary spreadsheet onto the table. Mark's corporate job has been bleeding cash for 2 years. Sarah, the business loan your husband took out last spring to save his law firm? That didn't come from a private investor. Eleanor begged me for it, using your future inheritance as collateral. The dining room erupted into chaotic shouting. Sarah turned on Mark, screaming about her stolen trust fund. Sarah's husband turned on Eleanor, accusing her of financial fraud, while my aunts and uncles looked on in absolute horror. Every single person sitting at that table had spent 28 years looking down on me, treating me like the helpless, pitiful black sheep. But as I watched them tear each other apart, the truth was exposed for everyone to see. Every luxury, every status symbol, and every pristine family facade in that room was built on a foundation of my money and my silence. Enough! Eleanor screamed, slamming her hands onto the table. Tears of rage streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She glared at me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. How could you do this to your own family? On Christmas Eve? After everything I gave you, you come into my home and humiliate us. You brought this on yourself, Eleanor, I said, standing up smoothly and buttoning my coat. You spent 2 decades using me as an emotional punching bag to make your golden children feel special. You mocked my life because you couldn't control it. Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched, his posture desperate. Chloe, please, if this gets out, my career is finished. I'll lose everything. You lost everything the moment you decided to steal, I replied coldly. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out 3 crisp, white legal envelopes, placing them neatly beside the dinner plates. These are formal legal notices from my attorney, I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. Mark, you have 30 days to sign a confession of debt and begin a structured repayment plan for the trust fund, or I hand the audit trail over to the district attorney. Eleanor, your lease agreement for this house is attached. You will pay a market rate rent starting January 1st, or I put the property on the commercial market. You wouldn't evict your own mother, Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest. Try me, I said softly. The room went dead silent. Relatives who had been laughing at me an hour ago were now staring at the floor, terrified to draw my attention. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been completely dismantled. I picked up my leather bag, turned my back on the fractured dinner table, and walked out into the crisp, quiet winter night. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the muffled sounds of shouting inside faded away. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying for 28 years. The aftermath was swift. Mark signed the repayment agreement within a week, terrified of facing criminal charges. Eleanor signed the lease, finally realizing that her days of controlling me were over. I set firm, unbreakable boundaries, cutting off the toxicity and taking full control of my life and my assets. People often think that success is about proving your doubters wrong, but it isn't. Real success is building a life so solid, so authentic, that you no longer need anyone's permission or approval to exist. I didn't settle down on my family's timeline, and I didn't fit into their narrow little boxes. Instead, I built my own foundation, brick by brick, in silence. As I drove away into the night, looking at the city's skyline gleaming in the distance, I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt free. Because the truth will always set you free, even if it burns down a few illusions along the way.